What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. We have David Benavidez, 25 wins and 0 losses, taking on David Lemieux, 43 wins and 4 losses. David Benavidez is the former two-time WBC Super-Middleweight Champ, 168-pound champ, and in both cases, he lost the title due to non-boxing reasons. The first time he had lost his belt was due to testing positive for cocaine, and the second time he lost his title was because he had missed weight in the COVID 2020 summer when he was about to fight Romer Angulo. So he was stripped of his WBC title twice without losing a fight. And David Benavidez is pretty much over the past couple years been one of the 2 or 3 fighters that most fans have been wanting to see fight Canelo Alvarez the most. Obviously, before this Dimitri Bivol win over Canelo Alvarez, way more people at the time were wanting to see David Benavidez fight Canelo than Dimitri Bivol to fight Canelo. And some people thought that Canelo was ducking David Benavidez, but I've always thought that when Canelo stormed the gates at 168, it's not Canelo's fault that David Benavidez was no longer holding his WBC belt. You know, Canelo was able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone in that first fight against Callum Smith, where Callum Smith had the WBA belt and he was defending that. But the WBC belt was also up for grabs in that fight because it was recently vacated by David Benavidez when he did not make weight versus Angulo. So I do think that if David Benavidez was still a belt holder when Canelo came to 168, that Canelo would have fought David Benavidez along with Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, and Caleb Plant. But David Benavidez in this fight with David Lemieux, this is seen to be, okay, this is another stylistic matchup. People just want to see David Benavidez in against better and better fighters because his skill set is really unique and it's making him look very dangerous fight after fight. And David Lemieux, if nothing else, is a very, very hard puncher, or at least he was at 160, where he used to hold a IBF belt before losing that to Triple G in a total beatdown of a fight. You want to talk about a fight being ruled by the jab? Go rewatch Triple G versus David Lemieux. That was actually Triple G's first pay-per-view headlining fight. It took place in Madison Square Garden. But yeah, go rewatch Triple G versus David Lemieux. But David Lemieux was one of the hardest hitters at 160. So if for nothing else, that makes this fight, even though it's at one division up at 168, makes David Benavidez versus David Lemieux at least a little bit interesting in that regard. But yeah, David Benavidez first started really hitting the scene, I would say around 2017, when he devastated Rogelio Porky Medina via 8th round TKO. That was kind of David Benavidez's coming out party. And he was super young. David Benavidez is still only 25 years old. So he was fighting Porky Medina back when he was 20 years old. And then he had the first shot at the WBC Super Middleweight title. It was vacant at the time. So it was going to be claimed by either David Benavidez or Ronald Gavril. But that fight ended up being a split decision win for David Benavidez. So he won the vacant WBA 168-pound title in a very close fight against Gavril. And, David Benavidez got knocked down in the final round of that fight. That was proven to be David Benavidez's toughest test to date. So tough, in fact, that he gave Gavril an immediate rematch. And in the rematch, David Benavidez pulled away and won via unanimous decision in his first 168-pound title defense. And then it was after that that he lost his WBC title the first time due to the testing positive for cocaine in his urine sample. And so after those back-to-back fights with Ronald Gavril, where, the first fight, David Benavidez was looking super fatigued. And, he basically said that he was rededicating himself to better conditioning. So that's why, that's one of the reasons why he had difficulty in the first fight and took a more commanding and authoritative win in the rematch against Gavril. But then after that, he fought Jalen Love, who was on Mayweather Promotions. He knocked Jalen Love out in the second round. So now David Benavidez is looking like a real stud, right? Well, that was early 2019. And then later on in that same year, he challenged Anthony Dirrell, who was currently holding the WBC 168-pound title, the same one that David Benavidez used to hold. And this was Anthony Dirrell's second time being a 168-pound champion. And so Anthony Dirrell defends his title against David Benavidez. This was actually on the Errol Spence Jr. versus Sean Porter undercard. And Anthony Dirrell, very good boxer, pretty good defensively. He was in some really good fights against Saki Obika back in the day. And at this time, his only loss was to Bout Jack, and that was against prime Bout Jack. So Anthony Dirrell, very quality fighter, is outboxing David Benavidez, at least in the first couple of rounds. But David Benavidez, as he often does, starts pouring on the volume to where Anthony Dirrell's, kind of defensive, I will start shooting my shots once you start coming in style wasn't enough to account for the punch output of David Benavidez. Not to mention Anthony Dirrell sustained a pretty nasty cut over the eye. But over the course of several rounds, David Benavidez started winning more of the rounds, landing more of the clean shots against Dirrell. Dirrell is always as tough as nails. I mean, this is a, cancer survivor, as tough as they come. But they eventually stopped the fight in the 9th round. So David Benavidez TKOs Anthony Dirrell, who, again, he was having several moments in that fight, but David Benavidez was just hitting him with too much too often. Plus, that cut started to open up more and more. They stopped the fight in the 9th round, and David Benavidez reclaims the WBC 168-pound title. And then months later, COVID hits, so they stopped boxing action entirely. When they started bringing some of the fights back, they had booked David Benavidez against Romer Angulo. That's where David Benavidez lost his title for the second time, this time on the scale, before fighting Romer Angulo, and then he stops Romer Angulo in the 10th round. So now David Benavidez is without a title, but he's still calling out all of the champions, calling out Caleb Plant, calling out, Canelo Alvarez, obviously. But again, he was without a title. So his next fight is against Ronald Ellis. He stops Ronald Ellis in the 11th round. And then in his next fight, fights Kyron Davis and stops him in the 7th round. Both of these fights, both against Ronald Ellis and against Kyron Davis, David Benavidez is, fighting shorter fighters who are throwing pretty hard and who are, basically moving, and then attacking. But still, that's not enough to keep up with the punch output of David Benavidez, who doesn't have like the greatest footwork. I mean, he's more or less just walking you down continuously. He doesn't even keep a high guard. He'll kind of keep his hands like right around here. And then he will kind of pick his spots to put the guard up when he thinks you're about to throw punches. But then he'll just start throwing like 3 to 5 punch combinations. And it just starts to get more voluminous as the rounds continue. So his punch output actually increases as the fight gets into the middle and then the late rounds. So he's just an absolute nightmare to deal with because he's putting you on this, treadmill from hell, round after round. And again, he stops Ronald Ellis and he stops Kyron Davis. And Kyron Davis, just 2 fights prior to that fight with Benavidez, actually fought a very close split draw against 2-time former champ Anthony Dirrell. So yeah, David Benavidez is slowly fighting better and better fighters. We'll see how good Kyron Davis turns out to be. But yeah, I would still say that David Benavidez's best win by far is against Anthony Dirrell. And now he's about to fight David Lemieux, again, who formerly held a belt down at 160, the IBF title, which after beating Gabriel Rosado for the title eliminator, basically, then fought Hassan Ndam and beat him via unanimous decision to claim that vacant IBF middleweight belt. And then in his very next fight, fights against Triple G, who everybody damn near was avoiding at that time. And David Lemieux was very game, but like I said, Triple G totally owned the fight behind a jab. Like, look at the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd round of Triple G versus David Lemieux. That's one of the best power jabs and intelligently placed and intelligently timed power jabs that you will ever see. Triple G just was amazing in that fight. And this is when he was like stopping like 19, 20 opponents in a row. So this is when he was on that, historic middleweight knockout streak. And David Lemieux added to that streak for Triple G. So after losing via 8th round TKO, and he also put David Lemieux down with a body shot in that fight. Just a devastating onslaught of skill, coupled with the ultimate power. Like at the time, Triple G, Sergey Kovalev, and Deontay Wilder were probably pound for pound the hardest punchers in the sport. But yeah, David Lemieux really didn't stand much of a chance. He had a puncher's chance, and that's about it against Triple G, which I think he also has against David Benavidez right here. But again, this is one weight class up from 160 where David Lemieux held the belt. So after losing to Triple G, he wins 4 fights in a row against Glenn Tapia, Christian Rios, Marcos Reyes, and then just before that Reyes fight, he being David Lemieux, delivered one of the nastiest knockouts you will ever see, and that came against Curtis Stevens. Look at how devastating that knockout was. And like Curtis Stevens' mom was outside near the ring apron just losing it when she saw her son get knocked unconscious just along the ring apron. It was just the nastiest, or at least one of the nastiest knockouts I can recall in recent memory. One punch, lights out, in the 3rd round. So it was after that fight that David Lemieux then fought Marcos Reyes, won that one via unanimous decision, and then he fought Billy Joe Saunders, where Billy Joe Saunders was the WBO middleweight champion at the time. So Billy Joe Saunders is defending his belt against David Lemieux. The fight is taking place in David Lemieux's hometown of Quebec, Canada, and Billy Joe Saunders puts on probably his best performance of his entire career. Just boxes an absolute clinic and schools David Lemieux, just made Lemieux look very plodding, slow, looked like he was always chasing Billy Joe Saunders, who was just boxing circles around David Lemieux. Brilliant performance for Billy Joe Saunders right there. And that is actually David Lemieux's last loss. This was in 2017. So since that, David Lemieux has been on a 5-fight win streak and only recently came up to 168. And all of these opponents that David Lemieux has beaten since losing to Billy Joe Saunders, they're not like super high caliber fighters. I would say the highest caliber out of those 5 opponents was probably Gary O'Sullivan, who David Lemieux knocked out in the 1st round. Well, at least Gary O'Sullivan probably has the biggest name. Can't really say that he's the best, but he's got the biggest name just because of who else he has basically lost to. Like he's lost to Jaime Munguia, and we've seen Gary O'Sullivan in some, somewhat higher profile fights. And, Max Bursak from Ukraine is also a pretty good fighter, and David Lemieux beat him via split decision. So out of these 5 most recent wins, 3 have come via knockout. So his punch is still, carrying. Even at 168, he's a very hard puncher. But I think that that's the only chance he has in this fight against David Benavidez. I do not see a method of David Lemieux winning rounds continuously against David Benavidez. Like, he might snatch up a round here or there, but what I expect to see in David Benavidez versus David Lemieux is the totally outsized David Lemieux, because David Benavidez is 6'1", and even though Benavidez is listed at 6'1", he fights so much taller. Like, Anthony Dirrell's a 6-footer, but against David Benavidez, Dirrell looked like he was giving up like 3-4 inches in height. It's crazy. David Benavidez is listed at 6'1", but he looks like his fight height is like an effective 6'3" or something like that. David Lemieux, on the other hand, was small even for middleweight, one division below where this fight's going to be fought. He is 5'9", and he only has like a 70-inch reach. By comparison, a couple divisions below that, Errol Spence, 72-inch reach. Terrence Crawford, abnormally long reach, 74-inch reach for somebody of Crawford's height. But Crawford and David Lemieux are about the same height. But again, Crawford, 74-inch reach. David Lemieux, 70-inch reach. So yeah, there's going to be a height and reach dynamic here, and there's also going to be a punch output volume dynamic here, where it's going to be David Benavidez who's probably going to be walking David Lemieux down. David Lemieux's not the greatest jabber, but you will see him throw a double jab here and there, at least when he feels comfortable enough to do so, to try to get into range to let his power punches go. Because in other, eras of David Lemieux's career, he's almost solely been a power puncher, where he's not even messing with the jab too much, and he's just trying to find his way into range to let his power punches go. But being that he's not a great boxer who doesn't rely on the jab to set up the power punches, it's really hard to envision the scenario where David Lemieux is winning rounds against David Benavidez. Again, he's got a shot at landing a haymaker, especially against somebody who's throwing as many punches as David Benavidez. And David Benavidez, again, he fights tall. He's not like down here crouching, but he is letting a whole bunch of punches go. He's got great balance for somebody that tall who's walking you down, who doesn't have the happiest of feet. He's just basically taking one step at a time. He's cutting the ring off pretty well, Benavidez is. So I could see him just being all types of hell for David Lemieux, who's looking to land the bomb, but who's in the meantime just eating a bunch of shots. And so for me, the question is, how much of this can David Lemieux sustain? Like, how much punishment can he withstand? Because even when he fought, I think it was against Max Bursak, who he ended up beating via split decision, Max Bursak dropped David Lemieux in the first round. So I expect David Benavidez to start hitting Lemieux pretty cleanly, pretty early. So I actually think that we're going to get like a mid-round, not a late-round stoppage here, but I'm expecting a mid-round stoppage for David Benavidez against David Lemieux. The question is, if David Benavidez handles business like most expect him to, again, this is kind of exciting just because David Lemieux does carry a bomb of a punch, even though we don't know how much of a bomb at 168 it really is. But we look at David Lemieux as at least having an interesting puncher's chance, and he's fought better fighters, or at least fighters. Yeah, I mean, he's fought Triple G and Billy Joe Saunders. So he's fought grade A level fighters. So it's going to be interesting to see how his experience carries into this fight against David Benavidez and what he does to weather the storm of David Benavidez. But I don't think that this one's going to last too long. I think David Benavidez's, downpour of activity is going to be too much for Lemieux, and I think that this is going to be like a 6th or 7th round stoppage for David Benavidez, unless David Lemieux just shows that he's willing to take all types of punishment and is still going to be in there. But someone's going to stop the fight. I think either the ref or the corner. I just don't see how. He's not a great defensive fighter either. So something's got to give here. If he's not landing a bomb against David Benavidez, he's eating shots, and you can only take that for so long. So yeah, I've got David Benavidez via mid-round stoppage. I don't know what David Benavidez does beyond that point. This is supposed to be for a shot at the WBC Super-Middleweight title, which Canelo holds, along with all of the other 168-pound belts. And it's going to be interesting because a lot of this, what's going to happen with everybody from David Benavidez to Triple G to, everybody else who's reliant on guys like Triple G and David Benavidez, Jamal Charlo, Demetrius. There's a lot going on, but a lot of what's going to happen in the future depends on the decision that Canelo makes in the wake of losing his title challenge against Dimitri Bivol. Is Canelo going to come back to 168 and start defending those titles? Well, whatever happens in the WBC part of the 168-pound division, David Benavidez, if he beats David Lemieux, is going to be a part of that title picture. So it's going to be interesting to see if, like, Jamal Charlo, after his fight with Sulechki, assuming he beats Sulechki, ends up moving up to 168. Or, whenever Demetrius Andrade versus Zach Parker eventually happens. It was just, postponed due to an injury to Demetrius Andrade, but will Andrade and Benavidez fight? It's going to be interesting to see how this 168-pound division shakes out depending on what decision Canelo Alvarez makes. But yeah, let me know what you think about Benavidez versus Lemieux in the comments. Who do you expect to win? And how? And how much of a chance are you really giving David Lemieux here? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.